Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for coming. I'm Cecil Giscombe. I teach poetry here, and tonight you're going to get to hear two poets, C.D. Wright and Christopher Patrick Miller. C.D. Wright's come to us from Providence. Christopher Miller is one of our own. The next reading in the Holloway poetry series will be Clark Coolidge on the 4th of November. So come back for that. And our friends from the University Press Books are here with copies of C.D. Wright's books. So buy a book. And I'll yield the stage to Jeffrey O'Brien.
Hi there. It's my honor to introduce Christopher Patrick Miller, who's ridiculously central in many ways to the poetry community at Berkeley. He's done the Holloway for longer than he should have. He runs a journal with Lynn and Gideon. I could go on and on, but I actually want to think of him now not just as a contributor to community, but as a maker of poems. So, the Greek term arche's broadest meaning is origin or source, and thus came to figure other things as diverse or bunched as substance, place, power, authority, and principle. It sits at the beginning of both architecture and archive, and we hear the play of its various senses all over English and its poetries, including Duncan's famous "Often I am permitted to return to a meadow" with its made place, quote, "wherefrom fall all architectures I am," as well as the buried arch of its ending, quote, "that is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is." Arche happens or builds or gathers everywhere in Christopher Patrick Miller's poetry also, and as it, many of his recent poems are called simply arch. It occurs in the titles as a prefix whose fate is not yet determined. The arch before it bows into architecture or becomes a permanent record in the archives. This not yet of predication comes from the poet's deep dissatisfaction with our present shelters, material, linguistic, aesthetic, all transpiring during capital's war against its own resources, bodies, persons, earth. With this refusal of fixed fate comes the restlessness of the prefatory and a corollary desire for an, quote, "anticipatory silence, infinitely breakable, searching a suddenness for a place to live," end quote. If we look rather than hear, we can see the silent arching even inside searching, a suddenness to be searched for habitability, a habitability we cannot have as yet, except in poetry. Quote, "We did not realize touching the spines in the thrift store that each decision would be a fateful shelter, would be a house full of things we would keep with no explanation for why." To keep the spine of a book from denoting a fateful shelter and the arch from becoming a house full of things requires motion, and Christopher's poetry moves across such formal variety that it often appears and sounds kinetic, impatient, desiring to use every thinkable distribution and segmentation of language, couplets, cinquains, prose blocks, untrackable haphazardries of stanza, all appear as the units of a slow, careful, considered discontent with shelter, quote, "every year a new house." This passage across the room's poetry offers enacts a search for the splendid cities that Rimbaud promised, which withdraw before the actual, policed, class-stratified cities we have. The ideal virtual city, quote, "long since absorbed by the cold-spotted flashing of what is." But Christopher is almost as tired or healthily critical of lament as he is of that which there is to lament in the world. Quote, "crying for all the things we have made quietly inaccessible, what is the worth in naming all these chains we have braided to link and drag ourselves?" He tasks himself to provide a positive model of care alongside the exhaustions of dragging ourselves places and naming their chains. He is thus also sometimes a clear-eyed, responsible love poet, celebrating its fragile infrastructure, the bridge between bodies howsoever composed, and often going obotic to praise morning's touch, a claritas from caritas, that reputable arch before all the fateful suffixes of day polity fled back. At morning, or in the time before a word completes itself, in Christopher's poetry is that searchable suddenness, wherefrom falls nothing definite, but still something unfinished, not yet, is there. Quote, the need to feel the feeling of what we need. Christopher Patrick Miller.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So as Jeffrey mentioned, I'm obsessed with arch as a prefix, as a process. I had this manuscript that I recently started sort of cannibalizing that was called Arch, and then I went back and was reading Vitruvius, who wrote the first sort of handbook in architecture, and I started reorganizing all of my poems using his 10-book headings as a basic structure to work in. So I'm going to read some of those, 3 of those. The first chapter in Vitruvius's 10 Books of Architecture is called An Education of an Architect. You and I never learned how to write justifications to the emperor. Our motives unclear, we learned to ask, what town are you from? And how did you get your water? How did you walk so far with that artless song? An architect should be equipped with the knowledge of many branches, optics, costs. By her work, all other arts are tested. The local pastor asks, build me a wonder, even the helplessly angry can afford. To build with what you have presupposes you have something to build and know what it is you have. The history we learned was her, marble statues with arms upstretched, a common dress made by declaring war on the people of Caria, the men killed, state abandoned, their wives marched into slavery with their nuptial robes we hardened into art. In art unfit to live that we call caryatids, not our demonic metonyms of, how did you let this happen to us? Cornered waits, our haunts, and all the prosecutors who pace the courts above, waiting for the officers to arrive. Who am I to judge when it is I who have built all your nothings? Proportion or harmony. Talk about some gambler who learned how to lose. When I watch him aim at music, the wind blows hair so thin on his scalp. I know nothing of walls, but these mouths cut to allow the winds through the perimeter fences of construction sites. I lean over perpetually, kissing the evictions of your future. Dear Caesar, do you admire my city? Resilient with its waters. Dreadfully, we would cry, touching the milk. I could laugh, but would you believe in our unsettling, heaving together with these scattering fetters of road? I am addressing this book to you because I am unaddressed, an architect practicing decadence with no good way to say goodbye. Pardon me or not, the wind is there in my rhetoric, my speculative grammar, my training to explain his homeless as a helplessness until she took him in, saying, you have that look of, this could have been different. What I learned from making my Persian columns, their eyes tightened, purple grinding, hands revising themselves in the cool dark water, milling corpuscular aberrations. When I visited their universities, the French professor told me that America is an empire of declining movements. With what confidence was I told this? In his hair, Absalom had butterflies shocking his dust with their blind patterns. When you pull on the color in my skin, it hurts. I grow older, a moonlit still. There is some resignation in these overtures of indebtedness, bemoaning what can be done about housing these artful slackers, black cows in our night, while a journeyman player, Heartlight, parses a sparse night with the notes he finds in his ukulele. You might know this one, A Bird in the Rain, improvising with the headlines, a lamp you drag by its umbilical cord from a pile of liquidated goods. Dear Caesar, why is it so hard to know each other, to call when we don't live in the same town? Given our obsolescence, our sentimental nature, our need for more durable, absorbent toys, the least you could do is give us another year of romance in this moon-stilling mess of too much to think, furniture curved, worn to gashes. So the next one's called Directions of Streets. The road is a scrap of tire tread, a colossal emptiness phasing, pockets with nothing left to lose. He said, first comes farce and then comes a phrase, the poisonous breath of marsh creatures wafted into bodies of the marshy inhabitants, the evenings aglow with western exposure. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the delicate, solitary folds overheard in a throat before a stroke gluts the motel windows with the sharp parts of a familiar face. We want nothing more than to be available. Among our second-hand armories, the powdered verve coating the bat's nose with white death that flies under the longest bridge. Crossing nothing but everything you could lose. Listen, I set up these fool words for you. A touchstone, a lodescar, a body sold into dark pools of supermarket prawns. Master letters, sketching a homely pain across the dandelion rag dirt. Another generous breakdown lane, pull over, I have to get out of this beleaguered copse of time. I stagger, thinking that despite the constant conversations, the flashing mob, or perhaps because of it, our language is more private now than ever. I thought of moving her to where she was warm. Well, the least of hearing your voice, the papers racked implosively on the phone, we value change or holiday gestures. In a second earth of trash, it gets harder to wake up for work when snow crowns horses. They sleep out our killing fields, the enemy combatants wearing coat flowers, no more dangerous than a mother whose fingers ratchet the only blue nerve in your mind. The oldest tree may be no taller than a child, who has come to you to admit it cannot open the fist it made. Years later, we return to our families, sinkholed, enfeebled, conciliatory, to admit we cannot find the pockets we have sown with coins in the dark. This canoe, out slowly into the oil, twilight, drinking what we carved, a realism of love, intractable, your skin is covering my skin, subjects to the unlived hours of ferns opening onto barricades, blistering riots of lichen, guns in the ground, what are we rhyming with? Alliterative feet, printing bears a mind. It takes the years to see the dream in our movements. All right, so this last one I'll read. It's called Origin of a Dwelling House. I could hear you in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet, crying for all the things we have made quietly inaccessible. What is the worth in naming all these chains we have braided to link and drag ourselves? Thin enough to be a straw, I could hear your water through the sheetrock walls, finding the fastest way to the ocean. We admire the child for the ways it improvises itself toward our affections. To what country do you belong? Resigned to the last notes we find, pelicans with Legos in their stomachs, stalled in the air, the incommunications of the dying. On our walk this morning, you pointed to the truncated branch grown around a wire. Even this petty fence of empire was muscled. Even you carry a portion of this cloudless world. In your wandering sinews, even you. In milk, can you taste it? The vast organic weight of our chances, speaking ways in and out, our remorseless cars. In a driveway, I watch her cry for her monuments to none of this, her cruel series of accomplishments breaking down to, we cut the closest ones. Grown folks, columned, doubtful graffiti, go find another lover to open the wall, counterpoint echoes of, look at us, we did not realize, touching the spines in the thrift store, that each decision would be a faithful shelter, would be a house full of things we would keep with no explanation for why. I managed to free some time, so I read over the brief life you stole in letters to friends. You explained the discipline you sought in music, what you had eaten, what you could no longer promise. By the end of them, you were writing to a woman I never knew, asking if any mail arrived today, and if she still remembers the summer night when you rode those heavy steel bikes through the abandoned gymnasium and what you had been told was the most dangerous part of the city. Thank you.
Mary Wilson will introduce C.D. Wright. Mary.
It is my great pleasure to introduce C.D. Wright to you tonight. C.D. was briefly a mentor of mine at Brown University, where she continues to push young writers towards a poetics of self-critical writing, a poetics of process rather than triumphant or self-satisfied completion. As she writes in Cooling Time, every year the poem I most want to write, the poem that would in effect allow me to stop writing, changes shapes, changes directions. It refuses to come forward, to stand still while I move to meet it, embrace and coax it to sit on a porch with me and watch the lightning bugs steal behind the fog's heavy veil, listen for the drag of John boats through the orchestra of locusts and frogs. For Wright, the poem is forever on the move, and the poet, if she is a good poet, will never cease chasing after it. Her poetry reveals the quotidian as a source of momentum, a particular energy emergent in the facts of being in a given time and place. And yet, the facts are facts, and they too are on the move. In One with Others, which was a finalist for the 2011 National Book Award, Wright offers a complex elegy to her friend and mentor, nicknamed V, the only white woman to join in the 1969 March Against Fear in Arkansas. Recounting the arrest and imprisonment of a group of black high school students who protested segregation, she writes, "They took them to the jailhouse in school buses. They took them to the drained pool in sealed 18-wheelers. The sheriff told them they were to be taken to the woods and there shot. The sheriff told them they were to be taken to the pool and there drowned." Facts shift. They accumulate, and yet there is no triumph of transformation here. As the poem tells us, a pool, a dry, drained pool, whatever else it is a big hole in the ground. A sealed truck, whatever else it is a sealed truck. These facts persist in their physical specificity. And yet, as the speaker of the 2009 book, Rising, Falling, Hovering notes, what has been said is said often, but also, who has been silenced cannot be unsilenced. C.D. Wright has published a dozen collections. Her most recent, One with Others, a little book of her days, won the 2010 National Books Critics Circle Award in Poetry, the Lenore Marshall Award, and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her other collections include Rising, Falling, Hovering, Steal Away, and String Light, winner of the 1992 Poetry Center Book Award. Wright is a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Award, the Robert Creeley Award, and the Donald Justice Prize. She is currently a teacher at Brown University. Please join me in welcoming C.D. Wright.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher, Jeffrey, I am going to read from One with Others. I think I'm nearing the end of reading from it, but I'm pleased to say I still enjoy it. Often I run out of that feeling before I have another book, and anyway, I still feel good about this work, which was written as a tribute to my friend Peggy Vedito. And once I started, I wanted to write about her, but I didn't know how to write about her without writing about her place and her time, and a point in her time at which she felt the most alive, which was in 1969, when all the towns up and down the Delta began to erupt in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. And my friend V is one of those many anonymous people who stepped forward. So it's of a piece, but I will read through it to try to give you a little sense of the patterning of the book and of the place. And I will probably foreground her because it pleases me to do that, and not the incidents. I will mention one because Mary already brought it up, and I think it may come up in this reading, which was that the students from the all-black high school in this town went en masse to the all-white high school in this town. This is 1969, 15 years after Brown versus Education, and locked arms and sang like a tree planted by the water. And they were arrested together, and they knew not to put them in school buses because that would be so illegal, so they put them in sealed trucks. And then they didn't know what to do with them, so they drove them around for hours and hours and hours. And then they took them to the public swimming pool, which had been drained for the season, which was whites only, and they put them in the swimming pool. At night they moved them into the Civic Center. And there were 3-4 black farmers who owned their own property. They put a bond for the students, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most of the students were quite invigorated by this whole thing because they were in so much solidarity. Some of them, of course, were traumatized. But there was also a teacher with them who helped hold them together, even though she was elderly and not in good health. And later I found that many of the people now in their 50s and 60s who did not participate, it was sort of the regret of their lives, but of course they were obeying their parents who were fearful for their lives. Anyway, that's the only story I will tell you about the incidents that happened there. So this is from One with Others, a little book of her days. I want people of 27 languages walking back and forth saying to one another, "Hello brother, how's the fishing?" And when they reach their destination, I don't want them to forget if it was bad. The battlefield where the moon says I love you, Frank Stanford. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. How it feels to be colored me, Zora Neale Hurston. Some names were changed or omitted in light of the interpretive nature of this account, others because they still live there. People may have been rendered as semblances and composites of one another, and others spoken into being. Memories have been tapped and newspapers consulted, books referenced, times fused and towns overlaid. This is not a work of history. It is a report full of holes, a little commemorative edition, and it aspires to the borrowed tuxedo lining of fiction. In the end, it is a welter of associations. Up and down the towns in the Delta, people were stirring. Cotton was right about shoe top. Daylilies hung from their withering necks. Temperature started out in the 90s with no promise of a good soaking. School was almost out. The farm bells slowly rang for freedom. The king lay moldering in the ground over a year. The scent of liberation stayed on, but it was hard to bring the trophy home. Hard to know what came next. One thing and one thing only was known. No one wanted to go home dragging their tow sack. No one wanted to go home empty-handed. Over at the All-Negro Junior High, a popular teacher has been fired for insubordination for a derogatory letter he wrote the superintendent saying the Negro has no voice at all. It was the start of another cacophonous summer. "It smells like home," she said, dying. And I, "What's that you smell?" V, and V, dying, "The faint cut of walnuts in the grass, my husband's work shirt on the railing, the pulled barbecued evening, the turned dirt, even in this pitch I can see the vapor-lit pole, the crepe myrtle not in shadow, my sweet Betsy, that exact streaked sky, the mongrel dog being pelted with rain, mine eyes pelted, all fear overcome, at last no scent." That's what she said, dying in the one-room apartment in Hell's Kitchen. I came in by the old road from Memphis, the old military road across the iron bridge. No one in the field, not a living soul. I drove around with the windows down, the red buds in bloom, sky a discolored chenille spread, weather generally fair. The marchers step off from the jailhouse at Bragg Spur, 8:17 a.m. More police than reporters, more reporters than police. The self-described Prime Minister of the invaders, 31, and 5 others have begun their trek. Sweet Willie Wine's walk against fear is on the move. The threat, they say, is coming from the east, of the 6 Negroes walking to Little Rock and the white woman driving in a station wagon. It was something you came through that. V, it was invigorating. It was the most alive I ever felt in my life. FBI followed me for a long time, stringers for the Gazette and the Appeal trailed me for a year. Once every 10 or 12 years I will get a caller. I used all of my life. I told my friend Gert, "You've got your life until you use it." I park in a spot of shade and walk around, downtown half shut down. Cotton gin still going, not strong, but going. Tracks working, neglected, but working. The infamous overpass brought down. September 15, 2004, Hell's Kitchen, her life surrendered to her body. September 15, the day Padre Hidalgo uttered the famous grito that kicked off the Mexican Revolution. She would have liked that, going off the air on a day marking a great struggle for independence. The river rises from a mountain of granite. The river receives the water of the Little River, the house where my friend once lived indefinitely empty. Walnuts turning dark in the grass, papers collected on the porch. If I put my face to the glass, I can make out the ghost of her ironing board, bottle of bourbon on the end. Her former husband, I'd come home from work and she would be in a rage and I just couldn't understand it. They were a poor match, he says so to this day. She said so then. They barely tolerated one another, but they were Catholic, another error bred in the bone. If he looked at her and she looked at him, in 9 months she was back at the lying in. My best guess, she woke up in a rage 8 days a week. Her friends, the musician, the poet, the actor, Gert, she taught me how to live. Now she has taught me how to die. And die, she was my Goomba, my Rafiki. It was the honor of my life to know her, honor of my life. Ellis. A crowd will gather and not know it walks the very street whereon a thing once walked that seemed a burning cloud. Yeats, she knew inside out, inside out. A man known as Skeeter his whole life. Oh yeah, I remember her. She celebrated all her kids' birthdays on the same day. I talked to a number of people in person, on the phone, mostly the phone, when I could get anyone to talk to me. I made so many calls. Can we talk later because I'm trying to cook for my family. He's not here now, he's fishing. I've got to go to the hospital to see my brother. He's about to pass. I've got to go to Memphis. I've got to work the night shift out at the Big Pen. I worked there since the plant shut. Can we talk later? I'm on neighborhood watch and the kids are walking out. There's no food here. I'm left holding the baby. You'll have to speak to the hand. This was my rest day. He's fishing. I'm working at the poles. I'm on pole watch. I've got to go to Little Rock for my checkup. My pressure's gone up. Since he got laid off, he's always fishing. When he can't go, he's home watching the fishing channel. So how is the fishing? Well, you know, it's lots worse elsewhere. The only sure thing were the prices and the temperatures. 2 pounds of oleo cost 25 cents and 5 pounds of Cherokee Freestone peaches are $1. The Cosmos Club president held a tea at her lovely lakeside home. 2 more Big Tree boys made fine soldiers. A rolling stone was found in the bottom of his swimming pool. Rufus Thomas and his Bearcats will headline at the Negro Fair, and Miss Teenage Arkansas, a comely young miss, is saluted once again for her charm and pulchritude. Sunshine Fresh High Drops cookies, 1 pound for 59 cents. The assistant warden at 300 pounds is the one identified for administering the strap at the Arkansas Pen, a self-sustaining institution. Several say they were beaten for failing to meet cotton quotas. Others, more often than not, did not know why they were beaten. One testified to more than 70 beatings. The strap is not in question. In question is when it is to be administered. The river is impounded by the lake. Below the lake, the river enters the lowlands. It slithers through cypress and willow, and the air itself cloudy or clear, stirring with smoke or dust or malathion, if you get my drift, must not be construed to be indivisible. No more than blood, there is black blood and white blood, there is black air and white air. This includes the air in the tires blowing out over the interstate between town and river, the air that riddles the children when a crop duster buzzes a schoolyard, the air that bellows from the choir of robes when the very reverend pillow bids be seated. And even the air socked from the jaw of the champ, born 17 miles west in Sand Slough, when he took that phantom punch, the year in which this particular round of troubles began. Today, gentle reader, the sermon once again, segregation after death. She had a brain like the reading room in the old British Museum. She could have donned fingerless gloves and written Das Kapital, while hexagons of snowflakes tumbled by the window pane. She could have made it up whole cloth. She could have sewn the cotton out of her own life while the Thames froze over. She loved words, cats, long-playing records, laughter, men, alcohol, cigarettes, the supernatural. It makes for a carnal list, pointless to rank. 5 in diapers at once, a stench she claimed she never got used to. It gradually turns from clear to coffee. The river receives another river near its mouth and joins the mighty river to the south of Helena. Yonkapin are the lilies in the ditch. Pretty bloom for a filthy drainage ditch, isn't it now? An Arkansas arc is not a rainbow, but an old iron bridge over troubled brown waters. Dear Abby, when Darrell and I were first married, he asked me to iron his undershorts. His mother always did. At first I didn't mind because we had no children, but now I have 2, and I could save a lot of time tossing them in the dryer and folding them. But I tried that once and I never heard the end of it. Darrell says he could feel the difference. What would you do? Dear, too much ironing. I would iron his underwear. You're wasting more energy complaining and arguing than it takes to iron 7 pair of shorts once a week. Everybody has a problem. What's yours? In Big Tree, people are reading their Bibles in bed. Their laces hang by their walking shoes. People are dreaming money, seamen, and bow eagles on the creek. Some could be soothed by a mourning dove. Some would be soothed by the Prince of Peace. V's bush was Sweet Betsy, I broke off a twig in her oldest daughter's yard. Over the coming months, I break it over and over for a quick hit of camphor. And offshore Camille brought rain that September, the year they put the kids under arrest and put them in the swimming pool. King called it a disease, segregation. Sounds contagious. It's cradle work is what it is. It begins before the quickening. When V ended up back in Kentucky after her expulsion from Big Tree, she kept a retired fighting cock. It was her only pleasure, Helmet. No one else could get near him. Long before this black and white issue, she said she was going to make up a coat of arms, and the motto on its heater would read, "I never knew what misery was till I came to Arkansas." Love, then, she was all but dying for, except the love of Catholic men who did not live to love, from whom it was an article of faith that life is and forever shall be for suffering. V liked to say it makes martyrs of the women and emasculates the men. If religion, she also liked to say, is the opiate of the masses, fundamentalism is the amphetamine. That busted us up. The hierarchy indisputable, the hereafter actual, sin she believed in, that she was born in and bound to do it. She was likewise accepting of being sinned against. Injustice she rejected, through and through. Something else, lie, was not in her vocabulary. The pure, inflammatory truth, she could take it, and gentle reader, she knew how to inflict it. All Negro High School Annual, Best Dancer, one of the boys beaten by the Night Riders, Biggest Wolf, son of one of the boys blinded by the Night Riders, Friendliest, his brother who jumped from the overpass, Best Running Back, his cousin, went pro in Canada, Smartest, her cousin, had his own car, he drove her to Ohio still wearing her cap and gown. Atmospheric washes of sound, play it muddy, play it freaking loud, lights sputtering and crackling. The only sure thing in those days were the prices. Jack Sprat tea bags only 19 cents, a whole Friar's 59 cents, a half gallon of Purex 25 cents, 2 pounds of Oleo 25 cents. Ivory soap 10 cents a bar, Cherokee Freestone peaches 5 cans for $1. And the temperatures. Los Angeles enters its 6th day of rioting, 32 dead. Chicago's rebellion ends in 2. KKK's lawyer dies in Birmingham. Hurricane Camille sacks past Christiane. The president of the Cosmos Club holds a tea. Soybean cyst nematode puts the county's crop under quarantine. 3 Brinkley children die in an icebox. It is time to pick the cotton. Her friend Bertie, we couldn't wait to go to V's house in the afternoon. Dell would call and say, let's go to V's. And I would say, I've got a yada, yada, yada. And Dell would say, just squirt some furniture polish in the air and Joey will think you've been cleaning all afternoon. The first time I met her, she told me about her goldfish committing suicide. She showed me a picture of her daddy. How old do you think he is in this picture? Ha, she said. He was an alcoholic and he was only 58 years old. She would have on Enrico Caruso and Nina Simone and Segovia, Bach and Leonard Cohen and Joan Baez and the Man in Black all on the same stack. We had a whole education in fine arts and literature in her living room. You've got to read this and you've got to read that. She had a lending library going on. You're not ready for James Joyce, she told me, and I never did read James Joyce, I just accepted it. We went big into T.S. Eliot, so I knew all about cats before it ever got to Broadway. We listened to A Child's Christmas in Wales every year. Dell and her husband Joey made it over to Wales and laid a rose on the drunkard's stone. She could have been a master teacher, but she said no, she couldn't. She said she had nothing but contempt for her teacher when she discovered she didn't know Swinburne. One ought to admit V could rise in record time to the condition of contempt. Her friend, the actor. She once got on a wrathful tear about a particular member of Congress or some churlish priest and ended up on her feet in a lively enactment of how she would like to saw that MF in half, left-handed. I guess an untidy job of it would have hurt a lot more. She kept her Saigon cinnamon in her purse so the fifth boy child couldn't get his hands on it, dragged her sewing machine to her porch because she did not want to have to look at it. When she had cancer after the last child was born and had a hysterectomy, she didn't want anyone to know. She didn't want them saying, that poor woman with all those children, and now she's got cancer. Excuse. Vines support an abandoned shack. Vines conceal abandoned farm implements. People are walking out of the ragged fields. Vines threaten the utility pole. Vines protect the copperhead from the hoe. Cottonwoods flutter as one. Bats at the cell tower, the tub in which James Earl Ray stood to slay the king, has sold online. Watch out for that phantom punch. Headline, the Negroes failed to move. The weather could break. The sheriff's button says never. The children's mind say never waver. V rising to contempt. And that sheriff, may he be taken to the woods and there made to sing like a tree planted by the water. May he be linked to the first rib he broke and it be fashioned of bronze and run through the end of his nose. He may then be taken to the pool and there taught the dead man's float. And then he be taken to the library and there will his hideous pink testicles be removed by the assistant librarian and put in the terrarium with the resident spider. The ethical this, what we really want, says my friend Harry, is to get the present in the present, that which is not this, to feel and transmit. The felony logs for that period are mostly devoted to burglary and grand larceny, bad checks, attempted escapes, embezzlement, possession of a machine gun for aggressive purposes, correction, possession of 3 machine guns. A man killed his wife with a hammer, a man found in possession of a 50-gallon mash barrel and cooker, and 1 poor fellow was popped for having unnatural relations with a cow. The biggest hit is Al Green, and the biggest hitter is Sonny Liston. The Silver Fox kind of stalled. A Quaker protesting the war in Vietnam has set himself on fire in front of the Pentagon. He dropped the baby out of harm's way before he flicked open his lighter. Phoenix is burning. Dear Abby, friends of ours have a son who has gone the hippies route. When we inquire about their children, they have others who are married and one who is in the service. Should we ask about their hippie son? Or should we just not mention him like he is dead? We know that they're pretty sick about the life he leads. Dear needs to know, knowing that your friends would be humiliated or embarrassed by the mention of their hippie son, don't mention him. Everybody has a problem. What's yours? Her friend Bertie. She was never a whiner or a complainer. She might rage for a minute in the most colorful language, and then that was that, back to the more interesting conversation she preferred. Did she have a priest at the end? I had to tell her that I thought a priest would enter at his own peril. Ha 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 ha, Bertie wrote back. Her husband would come home from work and she would be in a rage and he could not understand it. He would repair to his shed to build his models. There is a sanctuary in the mind made of balsa and glue, perfect little gliders constructed in perfect quietude. There is a sanctuary in the mind made of poetry and music and laughter. Whiskey and cigarettes never run out, and the ironing board is never in use. There is a sanctuary without the stench of diapers, the drone of the sewing machine, or the fretful pawing of rosaries. Dear Abby, my mother-in-law said she read in your column about how to make dirty diapers disappear. Dear Misinformed, I am not a magician. Everybody has a problem. V, deep down, she may have been as sad as a cover band. She might have felt drier than a clod of Arkansas dirt. Lonely, 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 like the hunter green suitcase that hadn't been used since her honeymoon. Some honeymoon, she later told Gert with that off-color smile. She almost had to rape him. She said this near death as her executive organs were shutting down, and she was finishing the New York Times crossword September 2nd in ballpoint. What is a suffix of book-ish? Who is a major exporter of coconut oil? Samoa. A colorless liquid? Ouzo. A defeatist words? I, no space, lose. The artist of the etching and equitant, El sueño de la raison produce monstruos. Does it follow that the sleep of monsters produces reason? It was the Thursday Times. They get harder. But the others got thrown out. This was on a shelf of dust under the silhouette where a boomerang had hung. The boomerang silhouette and the telephones and the outline of her iconoclastic altar stayed white. Otherwise, the walls were solid nicotine. Had cancer after she had her first baby, had a hysterectomy, didn't want anyone to know because she thought they'd say that poor woman with all those children, and now she's got cancer. An invisible woman. In Hell's Kitchen in her shaky hand and soft pencil, next to the sill overlooking the scraggly barren pear in front of her building, she wrote, Cheops, 2575 BC to 2150 BC, Moses, 13th century BC, to Homer, 9th century BC, Hesiod, 8th century BC, to Herodotus, 485 to 425 BC, Socrates, 469 to 399 BC. V, if I may ask, why did you write that on your wall? It's handy. It settles a lot of arguments, and with growing enthusiasm. That's not the first thing I wrote on the wall, though. The first thing I wrote is over here. Unless a proposition is necessary, it is meaningless, with meaning approaching zero. Burroughs. I still haven't figured it out, she adds with obvious pleasure. Then I wrote, be still. The hanging gardens were a dream. Trumbull Stigney. After she died, the photographer and I visit the apartment. I find what she scribbled next to where her phone had hung. What fresh hell is this? Below which, interposition and nullification. Harry says what we really want from our time on this planet is that which is not this. We want the ethical this. We want to feel and transmit. It is known that when a blackbird calls in the marsh, all sound back, and if one note is missing, all take notice. This is the solidarity we are born to. King said no one could be an outsider who lived inside these borders. There are no invaders. What the white man wanted no less than complete control, who expected the sidewalks cleared when they came down them, as in the days of the Raj. The boys hid under the Reverend's vehicle. I can't say if the Reverend knew they were there. I can't say if he didn't know. He probably knew. They hid on the concrete slab under the block. They held their breath and listened. One of them was hurt pretty bad, and the patriarch, the flat fixer, lost an eye. Hateful words survive in sticky clumps. Furry thoughts skid across the yellow line, and over the muddy embankment, big enough to hunt, being hunted, says the sheriff. Nowadays, you can't even say chigger. You have to say chigro. They fired the flat fixer that fired him after they put out his eye. The eel and the longueuil never were. The flat fixer who said he'd get the radio fixed, he knew who could fix it, they fired him. Never held an eel, she just slithered. The fixer, they said, stole their shortwave. He had it fixed. They fired him, but first they put out his eye, so they named it Longueuil. And the Mississippi receives them both, but you wouldn't notice now. It's casino to casino from here to the Big Easy. The other river, that would be the St. Francis. They said they would take this harm. They would take it this time, would move on. They would walk away, turn a blind eye. They would go forward into the seasons of their lives. They would see the sun shiver as it disappeared behind willow and cottonwood, the blackbird threading the phone lines, the combine continuing to rest on its haunches. They would not be deformed by this hatefulness, nor be comforted by religion, though would be their women. But if anyone ever touched any one of them ever again, they would put this town on the map. They made their pact, they took the no-quarter oath, they were 8 men strong, and they meant it, gentle reader, they meant it. They march along here, the military road, the road they built, built by humpers. Those were the Irish. They passed Blackfish Lake, ditch number 1, about where they crossed. Gerstacker slept here, bundled up in a buffalo skin. But first the Choctaw removal, then came the Creek with ponies, then Chickasaw, then Cherokee, maybe Sequoia among them, his syllabary nearly finished. Now stood another anonymous racist calling them names. His rod extended, his line hung up in his own ignominy. She was not an eccentric, she was an original. She was congenitally incapable of conforming. She was resolutely resistant. Her low-hanging fears no match for her contumacy. Grappling hooks in the mud, leaf out in the mind. She was my Goomba, cats, Catholicism, alcohol, and men. She served them all. Children, she failed her own. Of that she was acutely aware. It was the grief of her existence. I remember her in livid color, her with the radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy. The best mind of a generation in an era, a place that thought nothing of a woman, even a white woman, and of a black woman thought even less than. Some would say she was in full pursuit of her ruin. Some would call it her pathetic adventure. I would say you did not understand the magnitude of her longing. I say, where was the suitor to her senescence? Another disaffiliated member of her tribe. I say, do we have to go through this every time, this shunning thing? Any simple problem can be made insoluble, such as how to share an Alberta with a fuzz still on it. Crickets in the house are good. A crow is a bad sign. Empty rooms love the dark. The key to tranquility is equal opportunity. When the siren sounds, it's time for our curfew. Old moon, a wrecking ball, the town under demolition from within. Color provides a structure, albeit soul-sucking. The woods were felled by Chicago mills. An Arkansas arc is not a rainbow, but an iron bridge over troubled waters. Dear Abby, I am 11 years old, but I know all the facts of life because I live in a dirty neighborhood. My problem is that in our family, we get pregnant quick. My sister got pregnant when she was 16 just by sitting next to a boy in church. Can this be? Dear young miss, no, somebody must have moved. Thank you.
Thank you again for coming. Come back on the 4th of November to hear Clark Coolidge. Buy a book, talk to the poet. Thank you again.